January 12, 1945. The coldest winter in 50 years descended upon the Montana plains with a fury that seemed almost biblical in its intensity. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, and winds screamed across the flatlands with enough force to strip paint from buildings and freeze cattle where they stood. In the small prisoner of war camp outside Miles City, Montana, 32 German women huddled in wooden barracks that had been constructed hastily the previous autumn, never intended to withstand the full wrath of a Montana winter. These women were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France and Belgium. They had been transported across an ocean to a land so vast and unforgiving that it bore no resemblance to anything in their European experience. Now they faced a winter that threatened to kill them just as surely as any bullet. 24-year-old Greta Schneider pressed her face against the frosted window of the barracks, watching snow pile against the fence line in drifts that reached 8 feet high. She wrapped a thin military blanket tighter around her shoulders, but it did nothing to stop the cold that seeped through every crack in the wooden walls. Born in Stuttgart, she had served as a logistics coordinator for the Wehrmacht, managing supply routes and communications. She had never imagined that her war would end here, in this frozen wilderness, so far from everything she had known. The other women moved like ghosts through the dim interior of the barracks, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Liesel Hartmann, a former nurse from Munich, tried to keep spirits up by organizing the younger women into work details, anything to keep blood flowing and minds occupied. But even Liesel's determined optimism was wearing thin as the temperature continued to drop and their coal rations dwindled to almost nothing. Captain William Foster, the American officer in charge of the facility, had done his best to prepare for winter, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The camp had been established in late summer when the plains were still green and temperatures mild. The military had assured him that supply lines would remain open through winter, that coal shipments would arrive regularly, that the barracks would be adequate. All of those assurances now seemed like cruel jokes as he watched his prisoners slowly freeze. He had requested emergency supplies 2 weeks earlier, but the same blizzard that was killing his prisoners had closed every road and rail line within 200 miles. 3 miles from the camp, Eleanor Hayes stood in her ranch kitchen, staring out at the white wall of snow that had transformed her familiar landscape into an alien wasteland. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in the Pacific, leaving her to run their cattle ranch alone with help from seasonal hands who had long since fled south when the first snows arrived. At 42 years old, she had weathered hard Montana winters before, but nothing like this. She knew every rancher within 50 miles was losing livestock, that the cold was claiming animals faster than anyone could save them. But it was the prisoner of war camp that worried her most. She had driven past it countless times, had seen the thin walls of those barracks, had noticed how exposed the facility was to the relentless wind. Eleanor had lost her only son to German artillery in France, and part of her wanted to feel satisfaction at the thought of German prisoners suffering. But a larger part, the part shaped by frontier values of basic human decency, couldn't stomach the idea of young women freezing to death while she had a warm house and barns that could provide shelter. The German women had arrived at the Montana camp in late September, when the plains still held the golden warmth of autumn. Greta remembered stepping off the transport truck and being struck by the sheer emptiness of the landscape. In Germany, every piece of land had purpose, had history, had been shaped by centuries of human habitation. Here, the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, with nothing but grass and sky. It had felt like being deposited on another planet. Those first weeks had been disorienting in ways that went beyond language barriers and military routines. The scale of everything overwhelmed them. The sky seemed impossibly vast, the distances between towns incomprehensible. Frieda Vogel, a former radio operator from Berlin, had stood at the fence line one evening and remarked that you could fit all of Stuttgart into the empty space between the camp and the distant mountains. The comment had made several women weep, suddenly understanding just how far they were from anything familiar. Captain Foster had tried to run the facility humanely, following Geneva Convention protocols, while dealing with his own conflicted feelings about housing enemy prisoners. His interactions with the women remained formally correct but distant. He assigned them work duties in the camp kitchen and laundry, maintained discipline without cruelty, and tried to ignore the fact that some of them were younger than his own daughter back in Ohio. The local community's reaction to the camp had been mixed. Most ranchers and townspeople in Miles City viewed the prisoners with suspicion or outright hostility. Many had sons or husbands fighting overseas. The idea of providing comfortable accommodation for enemy soldiers, even female ones, struck them as obscene. A few churches had attempted outreach programs, but these efforts met with resistance from both the military administration and the prisoners themselves, who remained guarded and uncertain about American intentions. Eleanor Hayes had driven past the camp only twice since its establishment, each time feeling a complicated knot of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. She saw young women behind those fences, girls really, and couldn't help wondering if they had brothers who might have killed her son. But she also saw how inadequately prepared the facility was for serious winter, and her practical rancher's mind cataloged all the ways those barracks would fail when temperatures dropped. She had mentioned her concerns to neighbors, but most dismissed them with cold satisfaction. "Let them freeze," Martha Brennan had said at the general store. "My nephew died at Normandy because of people like them." Eleanor hadn't argued, but the comment had sat uneasily in her conscience. It was Jacob Whitehorse who first articulated what Eleanor had been thinking, but hadn't said aloud. Jake was a trapper of Lakota heritage who worked the territory between the Yellowstone and Powder Rivers. He supplied furs and game to ranchers and townspeople existing on the margins of white society by choice and necessity. He had stopped by Eleanor's ranch in early December to deliver a winter's supply of rabbit pelts and venison. Over coffee in her kitchen, he had mentioned seeing the prisoner camp during his travels. "Those barracks won't hold against a hard freeze," he had said quietly. "Woods too green, gaps too wide. They'll need help if the real cold comes." Eleanor had nodded, grateful that someone else had noticed. Jake understood survival in harsh conditions better than anyone she knew. His people had endured on these plains for generations before white settlers arrived. He viewed the land with a respect that went beyond ownership or national boundaries. To him, survival wasn't about politics or patriotism. It was about recognizing when living beings needed help to make it through winter. January 15th arrived with a blizzard that would be recorded in Montana history books as the Storm of 45. Wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the plains with such force that visibility dropped to zero. The temperature fell to 48 below, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes and turn breath into ice crystals before it left your mouth. At the prisoner camp, disaster unfolded with terrifying speed. The wind tore sections of roofing from 2 barracks, exposing the interior to the full fury of the storm. Snow poured through the gaps, accumulating faster than the women could shovel it out. Captain Foster ordered everyone into the remaining intact buildings, cramming 60 women into spaces designed for 30. But even the undamaged barracks were failing. The coal supply had run out completely 2 days earlier, and the women burned whatever they could find: wooden crates, spare furniture, even pages from books. It wasn't enough. Greta watched Katarina Becker, the youngest of their group at just 19, begin showing signs of severe hypothermia. The girl's shivering had stopped, replaced by confused speech and drowsiness that Liesel recognized as dangerous. 2 other women were approaching the same state. They were dying, slowly but certainly, and there was nothing anyone could do. The storm had knocked out telephone lines, making communication with military headquarters impossible. Captain Foster faced a choice no officer should have to make: watch his prisoners freeze to death while following protocol, or violate regulations by seeking help from civilians. 3 miles away, Eleanor heard the wind and knew. She had already made her decision before Jake arrived at her door, snow-covered and grim-faced. He had been checking his trap lines when the storm hit and had taken shelter in her barn. Together they stood in her kitchen, listening to the house shake under the wind's assault. "They're dying over there," Jake said simply. "Won't last the night in this cold." Eleanor pulled on her husband's heavy coat and began gathering blankets. Her truck had chains on the tires and a reinforced cab that could handle the drifts. Jake nodded and went to prepare his own sled and dogs, backup transportation if the truck failed. Neither spoke. about the risk they were taking or the hostility they would face from neighbors. When they reached the camp, Captain Foster met them at the gate with an expression mixing relief and resignation. He had already violated protocol by allowing Eleanor and Jake past security. Now he made another decision that would define the rest of his military career. "Get them out of here," he told Eleanor. "Take as many as your ranch can hold. Jake can take the rest to his trading post. I'll face the court-martial later." Within an hour, 32 frozen German women were being loaded into Eleanor's truck and Jake's dog sleds. The fences that had separated prisoners from the free world came down not through escape or liberation, but through the simple frontier recognition that survival mattered more than borders. Eleanor's ranch house had never held so many people. 18 German women crowded into her living room, kitchen, and spare bedrooms, their faces pale with cold and exhaustion. She moved through them efficiently, distributing wool blankets her husband had collected over 20 years of ranching. The women accepted them with trembling hands, too cold and shocked to speak. Greta found herself seated near the wood stove in Eleanor's kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that burned her frozen fingers. She watched their reluctant hostess move with practiced competence, starting soup on the stove, checking women for frostbite, directing the healthier prisoners to help the weaker ones. There was no warmth in Eleanor's actions, no smiles or friendly words, but there was competence and determination that transcended personal feelings. This woman had decided they would not die, and she would make that decision reality through sheer force of will. Across the room, young Katerina was being tended by Liesel and Eleanor together. The girl's core temperature had dropped dangerously low, and they worked to warm her gradually, wrapping her in layers, while Eleanor prepared warm broth. Greta noticed how Eleanor's hands moved with absolute certainty, no hesitation despite working alongside the enemy. It was the first time since capture that Greta had seen an American treat them as simply human beings in crisis rather than as prisoners requiring management. At Jake's trading post 5 miles north, the remaining 14 women experienced their own bewildering sanctuary. The post was a sturdy log structure built to withstand harsh winters, with a massive stone fireplace that Jake now stoked to roaring life. Frida Vogel sat closest to the flames, watching this quiet man who spoke little but moved with economy and purpose. Jake had hung beaver pelts over the windows to block drafts and was preparing a stew from dried venison and root vegetables. His dogs, magnificent animals bred for Arctic conditions, lay near the fire providing additional warmth. The women had been taught that Native Americans were savages, another piece of propaganda that reality was systematically dismantling. This man showed more practical kindness in 1 hour than they had experienced in months of captivity. As night fell, the storm continued its assault outside, but inside both sanctuaries, frozen women began to thaw. Eleanor served her simple soup without ceremony, ladling it into mismatched bowls and handing them out like a rancher feeding hired hands. No speeches, no requests for gratitude, just food and warmth provided because the alternative was death. At the trading post, Jake demonstrated how to wrap blankets for maximum heat retention, a skill his grandmother had taught him. He spoke in simple English, using hand gestures when words failed, treating the language barrier as a practical problem rather than an insurmountable obstacle. Greta finished her coffee and accepted a second cup from Eleanor. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. 2 women from different worlds, separated by language and war, connected by the fundamental human recognition that on a night this cold, shelter mattered more than hatred. The storm lasted 3 days, and during that time, necessity forced interaction that protocol never could. Eleanor's ranch operated on rhythms that didn't pause for blizzards or international conflict. Cattle needed tending, water lines required monitoring to prevent freezing, and firewood needed constant replenishment. The German women, recognizing that their survival depended on the ranch's functioning, began helping without being asked. Greta found herself following Eleanor to the barn on the second morning, struggling through waist-deep snow to reach the livestock. Eleanor showed her how to break ice on water troughs using an axe, how to distribute hay to cattle huddled against the barn walls, how to check animals for signs of frostbite. The work was brutally hard, and Greta's soft logistics officer's hands blistered within hours. But there was something clarifying about physical labor with immediate purpose. She wasn't a prisoner on work detail, she was simply another person helping to keep living things alive through winter. Liesl discovered that Eleanor kept an extensive medical kit, assembled over years of ranch emergencies where the nearest doctor was 50 miles away. The two women found themselves working side by side, treating frostbite cases among both prisoners and checking on Katerina's recovery. Liesl's nursing training and Eleanor's frontier practical knowledge complemented each other perfectly. They communicated through gestures and simple words, but their shared understanding of healing created a language beyond vocabulary. At the trading post, Jake was teaching his group of women the skills his people had perfected over generations. He showed them how to layer clothing for maximum warmth, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to move through deep snow without exhausting yourself. Frida, who had grown up in Berlin's urban landscape, found herself fascinated by knowledge she had never imagined needing. Jake demonstrated how to start fires in impossible conditions, how to purify snow for drinking water, how to recognize which plants remained edible through winter. On the third evening, as the storm finally began to subside, Eleanor did something unexpected. She brought out her husband's photograph from the mantel and showed it to the women gathered in her living room. "His name was David," she said quietly. "He died at Guadalcanal." The women fell silent, understanding the weight of what she was revealing. Here was a woman who had every reason to hate them, who had lost her partner to a war their country had helped start, yet she had risked everything to save their lives. Greta stood slowly and retrieved her own small photo, carried through capture and imprisonment. "My brother," she said in careful English. "Carl, he died in Russia." She didn't know if Eleanor understood all the words, but the meaning was clear. They were all caught in the same machinery of war, all losing people they loved to decisions made far above their heads. Eleanor took the photo, studied it for a long moment, then handed it back with a single nod. That night, the barriers between captor and captive, enemy and ally, began eroding like snow under spring sun. 2 weeks passed before military authorities could re-establish contact with the camp. Captain Foster had managed to get word through a ham radio operator that his prisoners were safe but dispersed to civilian locations. The response from headquarters was predictably bureaucratic and angry, but Foster had made peace with his decision. He spent those weeks living in the one remaining intact barracks, documenting everything in meticulous reports that would either save or end his career. At Eleanor's ranch, the forced proximity had transformed into something resembling community. The women had established routines that made the crowded quarters more manageable. Mornings began with Greta and 3 others helping Eleanor with livestock. Afternoons were spent maintaining the house, mending clothes, and preparing meals from Eleanor's dwindling pantry supplies. Evenings gathered everyone around the fireplace, where Eleanor began teaching basic English, while the women taught her German phrases in return. Eleanor found herself thinking of these women less as prisoners and more as displaced persons who happened to speak a different language. She watched Liesl's gentle competence with the younger women, saw how Greta naturally took on leadership responsibilities without asserting dominance, noticed Katerina's shy smile returning as she recovered her strength. They reminded her painfully of the church groups and quilting circles she had been part of before the war, before loss had made her withdraw from community. One afternoon, Eleanor pulled out her daughter's old clothes from storage. Sarah had moved to Seattle for war work 3 years earlier, and these dresses had been waiting in a trunk ever since. She handed them to the women without ceremony, watching as they traded their worn auxiliary uniforms for cotton dresses that fit imperfectly but offered dignity their prison clothes had stripped away. Greta accepted a blue dress that had probably belonged to a girl 10 years younger, but she put it on with reverence, running her hands over fabric that smelled of cedar and lavender instead of barracks and defeat. At Jake's trading post, transformation happened more quietly but no less profoundly. Jake was a man of few words, but his actions spoke clearly. He taught Frida and the others how to tan hides, how to repair leather goods, how to carve useful implements from wood and bone. These were skills his grandmother had passed to him, knowledge that connected to something older than nations or wars. Frida discovered she had a natural talent for leatherwork. Her precise hands that had once operated radio equipment, now crafting beautiful, functional items. Jake watched her work one evening and offered rare praise. "You have patient hands," he said. "That's good. Patience matters more than strength out here." The words carried weight beyond their simplicity, and Frida understood she was being taught not just skills but philosophy. When Jake's neighbor, old Tom McDonnell, stopped by to check on him after the storm, he found Jake teaching German women how to make snowshoes. Tom stared for a long moment, then simply shrugged. "Winter makes strange alliances," he said, accepting coffee and joining the lesson without further comment. The harsh reality of prolonged isolation arrived in early February when Eleanor's food supplies dropped to critical levels. The storm had consumed provisions faster than expected, and feeding 20 people through a Montana winter required resources she simply didn't have. She sat at her kitchen table one morning, calculating what remained in her root cellar and storage, and realized they had perhaps 10 days before serious hunger became unavoidable. Jake arrived that afternoon with similar news. His supplies were depleted, and while he could hunt and trap, feeding 14 additional mouths required more than wilderness skills could provide. They needed to go into Miles City, to the general store and trading post where Martha Brennan kept the community's lifeline of goods. Both knew what that meant. The town had to know about the German women by now. Captain Foster would have reported their locations when he re-established contact. But knowing abstractly that prisoners were sheltering with locals was different from seeing enemy women walking freely through American streets. Eleanor made the decision quickly. She would take Greta, Liesel, and Katerina with her. Hiding them felt like shame, and she refused to be ashamed of saving lives. Jake nodded his agreement and said he would bring Frida and 2 others. If the town wanted to object, they could do it too. Faces instead of behind closed doors. The drive into Miles City took 2 hours through snow-packed roads. Greta sat in the passenger seat wearing Sarah's blue dress under a heavy coat, watching the Montana landscape roll past. She had seen little of America beyond the camp and Eleanor's ranch. Now she observed small farmhouses, distant cattle herds, and the vast emptiness that still unsettled her European sensibilities. When they pulled onto Main Street, curtains twitched in windows, and people stopped on sidewalks to stare. Martha Brennan stood behind her store counter, arms crossed, face hard as the frozen ground outside. Eleanor walked in with the 3 German women following, heads high despite obvious nervousness. "I need supplies," Eleanor said evenly. "Standard order plus extra for guests." Martha's eyes moved over the women with unconcealed hostility. "I heard you were harboring prisoners." Didn't want to believe Eleanor Hayes would betray her own son's memory like that. The words hit like physical blows, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "My son died fighting for freedom and decency. I figure saving lives honors his memory better than letting young women freeze out of spite." Other townspeople had gathered outside, drawn by news spreading through the small community with remarkable speed. Reverend Samuel Garrett entered the store, his weathered face troubled but not angry. He had tried to start outreach programs at the camp and understood complexity better than most. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you've put yourself in a difficult position." She met his eyes steadily. "Only difficult position I know is watching people die when I can prevent it. You want to condemn me for that, Reverend, go ahead. But first, help me load these supplies so these women don't starve." The confrontation in Miles City lasted 2 hours and resolved nothing cleanly. Martha Brennan eventually sold Eleanor the supplies, but only after Reverend Garrett intervened and several other townspeople voiced reluctant support. The community remained bitterly divided. Some saw Eleanor and Jake's actions as Christian charity. Others viewed them as betrayal of American soldiers still dying overseas. The local newspaper ran an editorial titled "Mercy or Madness" that presented both perspectives without taking a clear stance. But the controversy forced a reckoning that military bureaucracy had been avoiding. In late February, a delegation from the War Department arrived in Miles City to assess the situation and determine next steps for the German prisoners. Colonel Richard Morrison, a career officer with combat experience in North Africa, came expecting to find a security breach requiring immediate correction. What he found instead challenged every assumption he had brought with him. He visited Eleanor's ranch first, arriving unannounced on a bitter cold morning. Greta answered the door wearing Sarah's blue dress and an apron, flour dusting her hands from helping make bread. She greeted him in careful English and invited him inside with a dignity that seemed incongruous with her prisoner status. Colonel Morrison observed the women moving through Eleanor's house with comfortable familiarity, noted how they worked alongside their hostess rather than under her supervision, saw the respect in their interactions. Eleanor stood at her kitchen table, rolling dough, and met his scrutiny without apology. "These women were dying, Colonel. I wasn't going to let that happen regardless of what some manual says I should have done." Morrison spent the day interviewing each woman individually through a translator he had brought from headquarters. He asked about their treatment, their circumstances, their feelings about Germany and America. What emerged was a portrait of gradual transformation that his military training had not prepared him to evaluate. At Jake's trading post, he encountered similar unexpected complexity. Frida showed him leather goods she had crafted, explained through halting English how Jake had taught her skills that gave her purpose. The other women demonstrated wilderness survival techniques they had learned, knowledge that seemed absurd for prisoners of war to possess, yet undeniably real. That evening Morrison met with Captain Foster, Eleanor, Jake, and Reverend Garrett in the church rectory. "The situation here is highly irregular," he began, then paused, searching for adequate words. "But I've been a soldier for 23 years, and I recognize something genuine when I see it." He explained that repatriation procedures were beginning across the country. Ships would soon carry prisoners back to occupied Germany. The women in Montana would be expected to return with them unless compelling reasons existed for alternative arrangements. Foster spoke first. "These women have formed bonds with this community. Sending them back feels like punishment for surviving." Eleanor added quietly, "They've become part of something here. They've earned the right to choose their own futures." Morrison looked at each person in the room, weighing regulations against humanity, then made a decision that would require significant justification to his superiors. Colonel Morrison's decision created unprecedented bureaucratic complexity. The women could request reclassification as displaced persons and apply for sponsored immigration status, but they would need American citizens willing to vouch for them, guarantee employment, and provide housing. In war-torn 1945 America, finding sponsors for former enemy nationals seemed nearly impossible. Yet within a week, Eleanor had filed sponsorship papers for Greta, Liesel, and Katerina. Jake submitted applications for Frida and 2 others. Reverend Garrett worked quietly behind the scenes, convincing 3 ranch families to sponsor the remaining women. The process revealed how deeply the prisoners had affected those who knew them personally, even as the broader community remained conflicted. Not all the women chose to stay. 8 decided they needed to return to Germany, despite the uncertainty awaiting them. They had families they hoped were still alive, responsibilities they felt couldn't be abandoned, or simply an inability to imagine permanent life in this foreign land. Greta spent long evenings talking with those who were leaving, understanding their choice even as she made a different one. She had received word through the Red Cross that her parents and brother Karl had all died in the bombing of Stuttgart. Germany held only graves for her now. The woman who departed carried letters from those staying, messages of gratitude, and stories about American kindness that they promised to share. They understood they were becoming ambassadors of an impossible reconciliation, living proof that enemies could become something else when treated with basic human dignity. On a cold March morning, the departing women boarded a military transport that would take them to New York, then to ships bound for Europe. Eleanor stood with Greta watching them go, both women silent with complicated emotions. Those who remained faced the daunting task of building lives from nothing. Greta worked alongside Eleanor, learning ranch management with an intensity that surprised them both. She discovered she had aptitude for the endless problem-solving that frontier life demanded. Eleanor, initially reluctant to admit she needed help, began teaching Greta not just skills but the philosophy of ranching: patience, adaptability, and respect for land that would kill you if you stopped paying attention. Liesel found work at Miles City's small hospital, where her nursing skills quickly made her indispensable. Dr. Hayes, the town physician, recognized competence regardless of accent. Within months, She had become essential to medical care in a region chronically short of trained personnel. Her gentle manner with patients slowly softened even skeptical townspeople. Frida remained with Jake, learning trapping and trading while developing leatherwork into a small business. She crafted gloves, belts, and saddle repairs that combined German precision with techniques Jake taught her. Her work gained quiet reputation for quality. Jake, never much for words, showed his approval by teaching her his most closely guarded skills, knowledge normally reserved for family. By summer, the women had begun the slow process of belonging. They attended church services where some congregants welcomed them and others turned away. They shopped in stores where merchants served them with varying degrees of warmth. 20 years later, Greta Schneider-Hayes stood on the porch of the ranch she now owned, watching spring storms roll across the Montana plains. She had married Eleanor's nephew in 1952, a quiet man who understood that some women carried complicated histories. They had built a good life together, expanding the ranch and raising 2 daughters who knew their mother's accent marked her as different but never questioned her belonging. Eleanor had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving the ranch to Greta with a simple note that said, "You saved this place as much as I saved you." The words had made Greta weep for days, understanding the profound truth they contained. She hadn't just survived that terrible winter of 45. She had been transformed by it, remade into someone who belonged to this harsh and honest land. The other women who had stayed had found their own paths to belonging. Liesel had become head nurse at the hospital, training a generation of medical professionals in rural Montana. She never married, dedicating herself instead to healing as a form of ongoing redemption. Her patients knew her simply as Nurse Hartman, the woman who would drive through blizzards to reach anyone in need. Frida had married Tom McDonald's son and taken over Jake's trading post when age finally slowed the old trapper. She had become a bridge between the McDonald, Lakota community and white ranchers, respected by both for her fairness and skill. Her leatherwork was now sought across 3 states, each piece carrying the mark of 2 traditions merged into something new. The women who had returned to Germany had written faithfully over the years. Their letters described the long struggle of rebuilding a devastated nation, but also spoke of how their experience in Montana had given them hope during the darkest times. They had carried stories of American kindness back to Germany, small seeds of reconciliation that grew slowly but steadily in the ruins of war. In 1965, the German government invited Greta to speak at a conference on German-American relations. She stood before diplomats and scholars in Bonn and told them about a winter when she should have died but didn't, because a ranch wife and a trapper valued human life above national allegiance. She spoke about Eleanor, who had lost her son to war but refused to let that loss poison her into cruelty. She described Jake, who had taught her that belonging to land mattered more than belonging to nations. Most importantly, she told them about choice. That terrible winter had stripped away everything comfortable and familiar, forcing her to decide who she wanted to become, rather than accepting who circumstance had made her. She had chosen to stay, to learn, to build something new from the ruins of her old identity. The coldest winter of her life had taught her what home truly meant. Not the place you came from, but the place that challenged you to become better than you were, the place where people saw your worst self and offered you the chance to discover your best. Montana, with its brutal honesty and unexpected kindness, had given her that chance. She had spent 20 years earning the right to call it home.